He found a staircase in the lake. It still goes up. He saw it when the wind fell off and the lake lay down like glass, a sudden stillness that made every shoreline detail stand at attention. The afternoon sun had taken a step toward evening, yellowed and steady, and the north cove of Lake Lanier went calm enough to show the bones under it. He cut his aluminum skiff to idle and drifted toward the pale shoulder of exposed clay. There, not random at all, a run of stone steps pushed up from green water and kept going into nothing the shore could explain, even and true, as if they still believed a front door was waiting at the top. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? This was late September 2022, after a summer of stingy rain and long afternoons when the heat felt like it had signed a lease. The lake sat northeast of Atlanta, a blue map of drowned hills and red clay coves, and that year it had read its gauge and decided to show some of what history had asked it to forget. Foundations revealed themselves like old teeth. The ghostly lanes of a two-lane road slipped out of the murk and pointed nowhere. Between Bald Ridge and the mouth of 6 Mile Creek, a staircase announced itself and waited for a person with the right kind of attention to see it. Riven Kettering had that kind of attention. 38. A carpenter and part-time rescue diver who liked small engines and the honest work of making broken things carry weight again. He lived in a rental off Pilgrim Mill Road with a dog who had taught herself to sleep through sirens. He was not a romantic, not really. He was the kind of man who listened to what a hinge said when it wasn't being looked at. The lake had been a job and a solace for him since he moved down from the foothills of Tennessee a decade earlier, and on afternoons like this one, he took his old skiff out to idle over the drown. The staircase began 3 steps below the surface, pale rectangles set into the clay, then climbed above waterline, slick with algae, where yesterday had touched and left. 12 risers showed drop. They marched up the bank as if they had no intention of stopping, then continued past where stone ended, the air holding their measure with a confidence that made nothing in Riven's head feel quite steady. He nosed the skiff forward until its snub bow made a soft knock against the lowest dry riser. The hull and the stone talked for a second, low and hollow. He stood, keeping knees loose, eyes at a level where you can decide a thing without pretending it's not, pretending you first. The steps were fieldstone set into a poured bed, careful work from when hands were steadier because nothing had asked them to type yet. He could see where the mortar had let go, hairline by hairline, and where a leaf had chosen to become fossil rather than compost. He stepped out. The rock took his weight with a small, agreeable groan. He climbed, counting aloud the way you do when a rhythm wants to prove it's a law. 7, 8, 9. A wet line at his ankles where he had waded the shallow to push the skiff in. 10, 11, 12. He stopped where stone ended. The sidewalls rose one more course and then gave way to air. Ahead of him, nothing. Above him, more nothing. And yet his right foot, when he slid it forward with the caution of a man who had once fallen through a rotten porch and did not intend to audition for that pain again, found resistance. Not stone, not water. Not empty. A density like stretched cloth, like cold-pressed sugar, like a stare that remembered itself and refused to forget, just because the lake had been told to be a lake. He drew his foot back, scalp prickling, breath in a pocket he didn't want to open too fast. He looked around to see if anyone else had been presented this joke. No one. In late September, a Tuesday can make a cove your private chapel. Far out, a pontoon boat moved like a floor with music on it. Closer in, a blue heron had made the stump of an old post into a claim. Riven set his palm above the end of the stone into the air where a banister would be if someone had finished the thought. He felt nothing until he pushed a hair past what he thought was safe. Then he felt a boundary, the exact height of a handrail in a code book he could recite. He smiled despite the way his heart had decided to pick up the tempo. Something here hadn't drowned entirely. Something here had decided to keep going up. He does not scare fast, Riven. He is a man who has gotten into dark water at night, kindly, and come back calmer for it. But he respects a place with a memory. He went back down the 12 risers and climbed into the skiff, and sat with his hand on the tiller and let the lake tell him if it wanted him to be braver than his grandmother would approve. The wind was a rumor now. On the far shore, a transformer hummed with the stale sweetness of electricity. He turned the motor off and drifted with his fingers brushing the gunwale and felt for the old current under the new. A loon called once out in the main channel, the syllable bending toward a kind of loneliness that doesn't need an audience. Riven looked back at the steps. The air above the 13th riser shimmered, a trick of light or a rule he hadn't been told yet. He swore softly in the old way that buys you permission to try again. He pulled the skiff onto the red bank, tied it off to a scar of root, and went back up the 12. He did what his hands knew to do. He turned a coin on its edge and rolled it along the last stone. When it tipped forward into air, it did not fall. It sat against nothing, as if pressed to a glass he could not see. He slid it forward with one finger and felt it drag over an edge. He slid his boot after it and met a tread that had weight. He put his full foot down and his bones agreed that physics had not been insulted, only invited to a different kind of party. He brought the other foot up. He stood on the 13th step of something that existed without confessing to the eye. He took one more. 14. He stopped. He is not a fool. He turned to look at the lake, which does not care if you find it holy or treacherous, so long as you understand which mood it is in. The cove held its breath. He stepped backward down the 2 air treads with a caution that felt like a prayer you say without agreeing you're saying it. He stood again on stone that had no arguments and breathed the kind of breath that renters of boats make when the motor coughs once and then forgives you. Lake Lanier carries stories the way clay carries footprints. Old towns lie under it, old churches, the ghost lanes of old Federal Road. People will tell you about a stalled truck on a fogged bridge and a handprint on the back window after, about divers who won't go down a second time because they looked through a school of crappie and saw a porch swing move. Some of that is what happens when humans leave water to be the keeper of their history. Some of that is people being lonely and needing their fear to wear a costume. Riven carried none of those stories in the silly way. He carried them the practical way. He knew people had been told their land would drown for the good of cities they would never see, and some of those people had said their names into the bank and put rocks one on another to make the land remember. He went home with the staircase in his notebook and in his knees. He did not say the shape of it to the bartender at the place on Brown's Bridge, who called everybody chief. He did not post a photo because the lake punishes people who turn it into spectacle. He slept badly and woke before his alarm and made coffee meaner than necessary and drove back with a coil of thin rope and a chalk box and the tape measure he used when perfection had to be part of the bill. Morning Lake, blue as breath. The skiff skittered over wind ruffles and slid into the cove willing. He tied a chalk line at the last stone and played it out up the air, marking nothing with blue dust that caught in nothing and hung there like a trick. He laughed once, quietly. He measured riser height with the tape and found consistency that would have made a county inspector nod. He tied a loop in the rope and lowered it down the near face of the steps. The loop sat against an invisible edge and held, not tight, not loose, as if politely told to wait. Half an hour went by that way. Numbers, angles. The carpenter in him building a drawing that would keep his fear inside its lines. When he finished, he sat with his back against the sidewall and let his head find the cool of stone that had learned shade. The world stepped closer. From somewhere he could not triangulate came a sound that reminded him of a bicycle bell rung just once. In politeness, he stood. The sound did not come again. He walked down the 12 and waited on the shoreline while the lake decided whether to ignore him or to grant him more. A woman called from the top of the red bank. Riven looked up. She was tall and rangy, mid-40s, wearing the kind of straw hat that makes a person look like they know how to move in weather. She carried a camera with a strap that had been repaired twice and a notebook bulging with the kind of paper that did not come out of printers. She introduced herself with a grin that answered questions he had not asked. Mara Clary. She ran a small outfit that mapped drowned towns and grave relocations for counties that cared to admit their forgetting. She had a copy of the Army Corps' old charts and a habit of showing up where the lake loaned the present to the past. "I've been told you've got steps," she said, "and that they keep going up." He wanted to ask who had been talking. He wanted not to have his name in a stranger's mouth. But she put her hand on the sidewall like a careful person says hello to an old horse, and the way her face took in what she saw made him feel less alone in his own seeing. He nodded. He told her his name and the number of air treads he'd let himself trust. She whistled low. "Lanier tells on itself every few years," she said, eyes on the shimmer above the 13th. "But I haven't seen it do this. Fieldstone, that would have been a front walk probably. Or the stairs to a porch. You can tell from the way these aren't as steep as church steps. And there would have been a dog who slept halfway up until someone came home at supper." "Everyone says that about any porch," he said, smiling despite himself. "Only because it keeps being true," she said, and laughed like a sound the cove had missed. They measured together, she took photos, he held a stick out over the air risers and watched the end bounce against nothing. They left offerings the old way. He peeled the paper off a peppermint and set it on the third stone step. She untied a strip of blue cloth from her hat and tied it to the root that held his skiff's rope. The lake, if it acknowledged that at all, did not show it. She opened her notebook to a page where she had copied in neat letters the names and dates of households taken when the valley was flooded in the early 1960s. 2 farms had sat on this spur, the Sumter place, the Jory place. Sumter had 5 children and a clean way with fence lines. Jory was famous for a Sunday table and a sour temperament the rest of the week. The county had cut checks and called it a necessity. The stairs could have been either family's. But on the sidewall, low near the 5th riser, they found a mark cut into mortar with a nail or a stubborn penknife. A letter. "Jay, you think Jory," she said. "Or June," he said. "Or Josephine. Or a boy who didn't get to grow into his handwriting rights, their first initial into any stone that isn't busy." The lake made a small sound against the hull, a shrug. They came back the next day, and the next after that. In the afternoons, teenagers on rental jet skis came doing grammar the water did not admire. In the mornings, a heron watched like a magistrate. Once, a man in a bass boat cut his engine and drifted nearer and asked if the invisible was real or a trick. And when Riven told him the truth, he raised his cap and said, "Well then," and idled away because some facts want to be left alone to keep being facts. On the 5th day, just after noon, when the light loses some of its slant and the lake starts its long exhale toward evening, the air changed. Riven was on the 14th invisible tread, Mara 2 below on stone, the rope tied at his ankle as if that kind of thing would help. He felt a pressure move across his shin like a child's study of a newel post. The hair on his forearms declared a vote. He looked up. Above him, a faint dark line hung in the bright. A lintel, if you wanted to pretend to see one. A line where a door might have decided to sit if it still meant to. He lifted his hand slowly and let it hover. It met resistance at the height where a latch would be if people had followed the same measurements here as they did in town. He pressed a fraction and felt the air give. Not much, not enough to invite him, only enough to say, "I know what you are asking for," and no. He withdrew his hand. He did not try again. He went back down and sat on the 6th stone step and put his elbows on his knees and let his head go heavy in the way of a man who knows the difference between a closed door and an answer. "Not today," Mara said, not unkindly. "Doesn't mean never." A storm ran around the rim of the lake that night and forgot how to come down. The next morning broke clean and noisy, with birds relieved to be right about the Sunday. When they returned to the steps, the peppermint was gone. The strip of cloth whispered against the root when the wind remembered it. On the 4th stone riser, a line had been drawn in the red dust by a finger that had not belonged to wind. 4 short lines, 1 long. The way a person keeps track of days when they are doing a job no one else is counting, they looked at each other like people who have been included in a conversation without earning it. Mara wrote down the marks in that tidy, practical hand. Riven climbed to 14 again and did not press the air where the latch would be. He listened instead. "It is an old trick. The more you don't demand to hear, the more willing a place is to say its piece. Somewhere above him, at the end of the invisible run, a sound came faint, almost an opinion. The scrape of a chair, foot against a wooden floor. Once, then a breath, remarkably ordinary, let out by someone who was done with a small effort and is pleased to have finished. He let his knees bend and went back down step by careful step. The county put out a notice, polite as a church lady, asking people not to climb anything that felt like absence. A man from the Corps came by with a clipboard and a caution that did not include humor and told them to rope the place from the bank. They tied a line and left it slack enough to be ignored by whatever needed to come and go. Mara logged coordinates and photographs and the exact color of the lichens on the sidewall. Riven made a drawing of the steps that showed the air ones the way you show trust with dotted lines and a note that says, as found. Word spread anyway. It always does when to leave a thing alone would be the more complicated form of love. A grandmother came and watched from the shade and told her granddaughter a story about the summer her brother rode a bike into a field that is now part of the lake and fell and did not cry, because corn leaves will cut you if you give them. An audience. A man in a Braves cap stood for a long time with his hands in the back pockets of his jeans and didn't tell anyone why his eyes kept the gloss they kept. A boy clapped once and apologized, and then asked if the staircase sounded like anything, and when Riven told him about the scrape and the breath, the boy looked toward the place where a door might be and whispered, "Thank you," like a student to a teacher who has handed out permission slips to freedom. On a Wednesday morning in early October, the lake rose 2 inches. The first stone step went green again. The 12th stayed dry. Riven set his palm to the sidewall as he had begun to do without design and said the names of the months out loud as if they were a key. Mara arrived late, hair in a bandana printed with little cranes, a thermos in one hand and a sheet of onion skin paper in the other, the thin kind that takes pencil and lets the stone's texture come up through. She rubbed the J, the nail-cut letter, and the tally marks. When she lifted the paper, the letter and the lines looked like a message written by someone whose words had to be rationed. She tucked the rubbing into her notebook with a care Riven recognized as kin to prayer. By noon, clouds built into a boast. Mara packed her camera because electric things deserve not to be insulted by weather. Riven untied the rope at his ankle and coiled it with the absent-minded competence of someone who likes ropes for the way they make order out of risk. The air above the 14th step felt different, cooler somehow, denser. He looked up and wanted more than he would have admitted the week before to see something acknowledge him. Not a face, not a figure, an idea. The lake refused. It kept to its rights. Before the storm broke, a small group arrived in silence. Not tourists, not thrill seekers. People in good shoes that did not belong to docks. A woman in a navy blazer. A man whose tie had been loosened by degrees and had stopped at 3. An older woman with a cane that looked like it had been carved by someone who understood trees better than money. They stood on the bank above the line and watched the steps like people watching someone figure skate after having once skated the same routine 3 decades ago and remembering what the body used to hold. The older woman spoke first, to the stone, not to the living. "You kept it," she said. "You stubborn thing. I told them you would." She introduced herself when Riven climbed down to the bank with his curiosity plainly showing. Ada Sumter Jory. Not a marriage, she was quick to clarify, but a habit of names borrowed and kept. Her father had been a Sumter, her mother a Jory by necessity and grievance. She had been 10 when the men from the government came and put stakes on the hill and told her they were measuring to make the river useful. She had been 14 when the kitchen was dismantled and stored in a relative's shed, and the porch chairs were put on a truck without the porch. She had been 15 when the lake finally climbed to the 7th stair, and the dogs refused to sleep where they had always slept, and had to learn ground new as a dollar. "My granddaddy set those stones," she said, chin lifting toward the steps. He knew the grade by eye. House stood there. She pointed at the air, ran long that way. Kitchen at the back, where mornings were honest. Stairs to the sleeping rooms tucked in right of the door. He told me we build stairs for coming and going and for waiting. That last part is where the world gets the math wrong. She cleared her throat once, a small thing that meant a larger thing had moved through it. My brother wrote his letter J in the mortar before it set, she said, and smiled fully for the first time. He was 5 and mad because he had not been allowed to carry a stone and needed to have done something the porch would remember. They watched the lake together as it considered which forenoon belonged to which afternoon. Mara showed Ada the rubbing, and Ada put her palm on the paper like a hand over a baby's sleeping flank. He stayed mean, she said of Jory, but without any real heat. But he loved that stare. Sat halfway up when he had nothing to do and the weather had nothing to argue about. Played that little bell you keep hearing because he liked the neatness of a sound that stops when you take your finger off it. The storm arrived. They covered what needed covering. The skiff rocked and complained, and then remembered it had been in worse moods and calmed. The rain washed the red dust off the risers and gave them back their gray. The air cooled like a head turning on a pillow to the comfortable side. Ada walked down to the second step and touched it like the forehead of a child with a fever breaking. Enough, she said to the rain, to the year, to the air that had learned to hold treads. In the weeks that followed, the staircase did what durable things do when they decide to belong to more than one story. It kept being itself. The lake rose and smudged the lower steps and then pulled back like a long breath returned. Riven kept coming because he had begun to like the feeling of leaving a place better than he found it by doing nothing but listening the way a well-made chair listens when a tired person sits. Mara wrote a piece for the County Historical Society that began with the sentence, "There are places we drown and places that refuse." Ada came twice more and told the stair her brother's best and worst. And once, on a bright Sunday, when the buzz of outboards sounded like cicadas pretending to be important, she brought a tin of biscuits and left one on the third step because her mother would have called it manners. On a morning in November, the air thin and brisk, frost like pale sugar on shaded clay, Riven came alone. The lake had taken back an inch, the first 2 steps glowed green. He stood at the foot and waited the way you learn to wait when you've been given more than you asked and are smart enough not to get greedy. The wind came off the water and put its fingers through his hair with a familiarity he hadn't earned. Above the 14th tread, the line where a lintel would be shivered and then settled. He put his hand out at the height of a latch and did not press. "Thank you," he said to nothing and to something. He went home and made lunch and fixed a neighbor's sagging cabinet and walked his dog in the long honey of 4 o'clock. He slept that night without the lake climbing the stairs of his thoughts. He dreamed he was sanding a handrail he could not see and woke with the particular ache in his forearm that tells a man he did a good day's work in the world that matters and the one that does not need him but lets him in anyway. If you go out to Lake Lanier on a fall day after a long dry, when the wind has the courtesy to lie down and let the surface polish itself, you can find the cove if you know who to ask and you promise out loud not to bring a ladder. The staircase will be there, stepping up from water into air with the patience of a body that has learned not to argue with time. You can put your boot on the 12th stone and your breath on your rib cage and decide if you will push your foot forward into the space where the 13th waits. If you do, it will hold. Not because wonder owes you, but because someone set a measure here with care, and because sometimes the world keeps an old promise in a new element. Say the year out loud when you find it. 2022. Say the place by its names, Lanier and the valley it drowned. Say the people if you know them. Sumter, Jory. Say the letter on the wall, J. Say the noise a bicycle bell makes when a brother likes attention and the porch has all afternoon. If you leave something, make it small. A ribbon, a peppermint. A finger laid gently in dust to make a line that will blow away with the next weather. Walk back down, let your knees do what they were built to do. Put your hand on the sidewall the way you would on a friend's shoulder when leaving them on their own porch in the dark to listen to the crickets. The staircase will keep going up whether or not your eyes can follow it. It will keep its measure in the air. The lake will rise and cover the lower treads and then fall back and confess again. Boats will hum. Herons will judge. A woman in a straw hat will rub letters onto paper, and a man with a dog who sleeps through sirens will coil rope and listen. And somewhere under the calm skin of the cove, where red clay holds onto everything it can hold, a front door you cannot see will stay shut and not unkindly, practicing the hardest kind of hospitality there is, offering you a way to ascend and a way to wait, and trusting you to know which one belongs to you today. A hiker found a phone recording. The last minute, he found the phone just before dusk on a switchback above Blue Lake in the San Juan Mountains of southwest Colorado. It lay half buried in scree, face up, a spiderweb crack stitched across the glass, the red record dot stubbornly pulsing as if the device itself refused to look away from whatever it had heard. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? The hiker's name was Ansel Rook, 33. A lineman from Pueblo who spent his days climbing utility poles and his weekends climbing whatever rose higher than his weekdays dared. It was late September 2021. The sky had that high-altitude rinse of cobalt that makes evergreen needles look sharper than they are. Below him, the water in the lake caught the last light and held it like a breath. Above him, a line of weather gathered beyond the ridgeline, thin-boned at first, then thickening into something like intention. Ansel lifted the phone with 2 fingers, the way you lift a bird that might be stunned but alive. The recording timestamp read 4:57 p.m. The battery icon showed 2%, then 1. He hesitated. The screen was smeared with a comma of dirt, the kind that comes from a palm skidding along gravel. He did not press play right away. He looked around first, because that is what you do when you find a thing that wants to tell you a story. You make room for it by seeing the place where the story happened. The switchback clung to an outthrust of talus and alpine grass, long blades moving in a wind that never quite became a gust. A cairn stood a little off the trail, too tidy to be natural, too thoughtful to be a prank. 2 boot prints were pressed into a patch of damp earth near the cairn, heel then toe, the kind of prints that happen when someone stops and leans forward for a better look at something that never asked to be looked at. Beyond that, the slope fell away into a tumble of shale and broken quartzite, a gray throat that could swallow a person without even needing to clear its own voice. He pressed play. First came footsteps, soft, measured, the sound of trail shoes finding their way over loose stone. Then, wind, not a roar, but a long vowel. A woman's breath, a zipper. The little chirp of a trekking pole knocking against a rock, and then being caught, steadied, forgiven. A far-off raven called once. Then, once again. The recording clipped and crackled, and then let the sound in wider, as if the phone had been lifted from a pocket. The woman's voice arrived next, not speaking to the phone, not to herself exactly, but to the place. Almost there, she said, and even in 2 words there was a smile you could hear. Another voice came in, thinner with distance, male, from above or beyond a switchback. Ansel could not see from his spot. Don't cut the corner. The tone was teasing, not scolding. It carried the kind of affection that worries by pretending not to. I know, the woman answered, and you could hear the grin get wider, as if she liked being told a rule she had already decided to follow. Ansel glanced up the trail, no silhouettes against the ridge, no packs leaning against a crumhole spruce, no motion that would explain a pair becoming 0. On the recording, the footsteps paused, the little metallic skr of a carabiner, a soft hum, tuneless and content, then a small sound that was not content at all. A pebble moving in a way pebbles do not choose for themselves, a slide that was also a decision. Hey, the man's voice said, quick now, and closer, and then there was skin and throat panic wrapped in one word, wait. The breath on the audio sped up, a severe silence followed, a silence full of edges, the way silence gets when it is about to be broken by something you cannot rewind. Then a single sound Ansel would think about later and later and later, a thump like a hand slapping the top of a piano closed. A gasp that turned into a half laugh, because sometimes the body does not admit the truth on the first try. A scrabbling, nails on stone, the phone fell or was dropped. The microphone scraped against the ground and filled the world with sand. Voices blurred. A name rose up out of the grit. Junia. The word was carried like a prayer someone forgot how to finish. More sliding. A shout that stopped without a period. A sound like a pack hitting and then being dragged. Then only wind. Wind and the long, small sparrow of a cry that arrived uninvited from very far down, which might have been a person and might have been Granite learning how to speak. The recording ended because the battery couldn't pretend any longer. Ansel stood very still, the phone warm now in his hand, the way a telling is warm the second time through. He tried the word on his own tongue. Junia. He looked where the two boot prints ended and where the ground began to pretend it was a floor but wasn't. He approached the cairn and hated it for existing and thanked it for marking the spot all at once. He kneeled and saw the narrow, scraped shine a person leaves when their boot finds a path no one built for it. The first drops hit his neck. Big, impatient, high country drops that are not water at all, but announcements. He lit his headlamp early, not because he needed it, but because a cone of light sometimes manages the world better than a wide, honest dark. He pulled an orange bandana from his pocket and tied it to the cairn. He took 3 photos in a slow circle: ground, slope, lake, and the way the sky had folded its arms. Then he did the most useful thing he knew. He climbed down to cell range. The call to the San Juan County Sheriff rang once, twice, and then a voice that had said this greeting more times than it wanted to answered with a name Ansel would remember. Deputy Cale Morrow. Calm. Not bored. Ready. Ansel described it carefully. Coordinates from his handheld GPS, the audio, the voices, the shape the trail made where it almost shook hands with the slope and then thought better of it, the bandana, the weather, rumored by the sky. Stay off the fall line, Morrow said. Get back to Timberline if you can and wait for search and rescue to reach you. Do not go after anyone you cannot see. He breathed in a way that made the phone sound like a lung. We've had a call about a late return from the Blue Lake Spur today. Your timing is not unlucky. It is the clock we were already watching. Ansel did as he was told. He descended to the last stand of wind-shaved spruce and waited, the kind of waiting that hums through bone. He could hear the storm organize itself on the ridge. He could feel how the mountains wear weather like a mood, quickly, convincingly, and then change it without apologizing. Headlamps appeared in the first gray of evening, a cluster of steady stars moving with purpose. 4 figures and a 5th slighter one moving with the confidence of a person who knows where the rocks are even when the rocks won't tell you. The 5th lifted a hand. Her hood was down despite the wind. Her hair was braided tight to keep the night from borrowing it. I'm Dory Keene, she said. San Juan Search and Rescue. This is Micah, Jovan, Arthur, and Wren. You the caller. Ansel nodded and gave them the phone. Dory turned the volume up and held the device near her ear, head bent, eyes closing in that way people have when they magnify one sense by dimming the rest. The others listened too, the small team suddenly one organism. When the man said wait, their spines stilled. When the name rose, Dory's mouth pressed flat, not cold, not warm. Deciding. She handed the phone back and pointed. Show me. They climbed in a line, the kind of line that knows which stones you can trust and which pretend to be trustworthy. The cairn found them. The bandana shivered in its small way. Dory crouched, laid 2 fingers on the scraped shine, and read it the way some people read Braille, asking for permission first. She looked down the slope, her eyes adjusted to a grammar Ansel did not speak. We anchor here, she said. 2 down to the first ledge, 2 on belay, Wren with me at the lip. You, Ansel Rook, you stay with Wren. If I tell you to move left, you move left. He swallowed, which tasted like metal, and nodded. The first thunder spoke. Not near, not far. The polite cousin of a threat. Rope hissed through gloves. Metal clinked with the bright sound mountain metal makes, a sound that knows at least 3 languages and prefers the most precise. Dory called down softly and answered herself when the wind was too busy to carry voices back up. 30 minutes grows very large when you cannot spend it on your own terms. The storm ignored them and then considered them and then walked away to another valley. The sky tried on a paler blue for a minute to see if it fit. Ansel watched a chipmunk watch them with the same fascination he felt. The animal had the kind of confidence that comes from being very good at running from everything. A shout made of 2 syllables rose from below, triumphant and careful at once. Got one? Dory closed her eyes for just long enough to speak without words to whatever listens up there. Then she called back. Name. Micah's voice floated up, thinner than it should have been. Junia. Alive. The sound inside Ansel's chest became something he had not realized he was holding back. He breathed it out in one steady line and leaned both palms into the earth, because you should always touch what keeps you from falling. They worked then. A litter arrived in pieces on shoulders and came together like an idea that had been there all along. Hands did what hands should do when someone needs to be lifted from one kind of gravity into another. They spoke to the person on the ledge in short lines, the way you speak to a horse you love and do not want to spook. Junia, we have you. Junia, do you feel this? Junia, breathe in when I count to 3. We're moving on, nowhere but up. Rain made a sentence across the slope and then erased it again. The wind forgot itself and then remembered. A raven rode the air as if it had invented it. Ansel saw her when they came over the lip. She had the look of someone who had been negotiating with Stone and won, but did not yet dare to celebrate. Mid-30s maybe, hair the color of straw left in the sun, eyes that wanted to close and would not. Blood dried in a tidy line along her left temple. The right knee of her hiking pants was torn, and beneath it, angry purple began to write its name. A bracelet made of 2 woven cords circled her wrist, one blue, one green. The blue was frayed as if teeth had once worried it during a long night. She looked at Ansel first, not because of anything he had done, but because his face was the closest one when the world came back into focus. Her voice was rough from cold and prayer. Did you hear it? Did you hear me call him? He did not know who him was, and it did not matter. Yes, he said, as if yes were a kind of bandage. We heard you. We came. They moved her in the neat, practiced way people move someone who is more precious than anything else in the room. The rope line looked like music from a distance. The lightning threatened to tune its instruments and then decided not to play. The litter found the shadow of the pines and then the steeper shadow of the trail through meadow. 2 miles became an hour. The trail had arrived with the small surprise a finish line always carries. A white truck from the county waited, engine narrating its own faithfulness. A paramedic named Orrin Hux set hands on Junia with the kind of competence that makes even pain look smaller around the edges. He asked her name to ask her other things. Junia Ridge, she said. 35. From Albuquerque. Came up yesterday. Intended to camp. Yes, I was with someone. He was up the switchback. It was our second turn around the lake. That's his phone. She watched Ansel put the device into Orrin's outstretched palm and then closed her eyes because the world was too heavy to carry all the way open. Orrin asked the question that had to be asked. Where is he? Junia shook her head once, a small, broken metronome. I don't know. I slipped. He yelled. I caught the ledge. I don't know. Dory stood with her back to the truck and looked up at the ridge. Even from the trailhead, she could read the day along the stone. She spoke into the radio with the language that belongs to people who need updates to be short and full, second subject unaccounted, male voice on recovered audio, last known above Blue Lake Switchback 2, weather marginal, lightning east. Request second team from Telluride side if available, plus 1 dog on dawn, copy. It was full dark when the second team arrived. Headlamps stitched the slope like fireflies, convinced they were surgeons. The dog named Palace, coat black as a charcoal drawing that had learned to move, took the scent from a hat Junia had kept tucked under her hip belt. The dog read the ground like an old friend's letter. Up to the cairn, left where the trail pretends it is a suggestion. Down 3 shelves of stone, some people would call cliffs, and other people would call arguments. Then the animal stopped, sat, whined once, and put its chin on its paws. They found nothing that night. Not nothing in that cruel sense, but nothing you could put your hands on and say this belongs to him. No pack, no trekking pole, no hat. No snack wrapper with a name in tidy black letters like a first day of school. The mountain held its tongue. Morning came with a sky made of tin and apology. They went again, Palace worked again, Wren set anchors again. Micah called in a voice that refused to become thin. Ansel was sent home because there is a point where more bodies become less help. He drove south toward Durango, the road curling along the Animas River, cottonwoods just beginning to try on their gold. He listened to the recording once more in the motel parking lot, sitting very still, as if any motion would knock truth out of the speakers. Junie awoke in a bed that had rails and numbers and beeps. Two things lived in her body now: pain and the certainty that she had not imagined the second voice. The nurse wrote her name on a whiteboard that greeted morning patients like a cheerful aunt. Junia. The day. The plan. The surgeon's name with its syllables arranged like fence posts. Deputy Cale Morrow came in late morning. He had the kind of careful that does not pretend it isn't careful. He set a small gray recorder on the tray table with the gelatin cup and did not move it closer to her as if it were a burden. He asked permission. She nodded. He asked again, because some nods do not mean yes. She said yes. He pressed the button and spoke the words aloud the way people do when they want to make the world behave. Interview with Junia Ridge. Date, time, present, she told him. The way the weather had looked all day like a bluff, and how bluffs tire themselves out eventually. The man she had met at the trailhead that morning when she realized she'd left her stove fuel on the driver's seat back in town, and he had said without flinching, "I have more than I need, take mine." His name was Orrin Bale. Not a common name, which helped the telling and hurt the hurt. He was 39, maybe 40. He had the kind of smile that makes coffee taste the way it ought to. He had the kind of pace that lets conversation sit down and stay a while. He had his sister's dog and a photo on his phone, and had not tried to pretend it was his own. He had said it was his first time above 12,000 feet since he was a boy, and that the air was thinner, but his head felt clearer, and wasn't that funny. She had not planned to hike with him. They had both headed out early to beat the thunderheads that never quite decided to arrive. They crossed the first creek together because rocks are often friendships in disguise. They turned at the little waterfall, then again where the climb gets greedy. Somewhere near noon, they split. He to the saddle above the lake to look for ptarmigan, she to the outcrop on the western side where the blue looks bottomless and makes you feel the size of your own heartbeat. They regrouped by accident among a stand of willows that kept the wind in its coat. They ate together because food tastes better when someone else laughs at your almonds for being aspirational and you laugh at their gummy bears for being perfect. He offered the second loop around the lake, and she said yes, because saying yes is sometimes a way of agreeing with the day. And then the fall. And then the seconds that were longer than seconds. The name she tried to lace to him as if names were rope. The way the ledge held and then complained and then held again. The fact that there had been no shout that sounded like pain, only a shout that sounded like surprise, and then a long conversation between gravity and silence that ended with silence believing it had won. Cale listened the way people listen when they use listening as a tool. He did not say, "I am sorry," in the first 5 minutes, because sometimes sorry has to wait its turn behind words that can anchor an actual investigation. He asked for a description that could be drawn into a cruiser laptop sketch. He asked for the brand of the pack, the color of the jacket, the kind of hat. He asked if Orrin had a habit of humming, joking, leaning to his left when he walked. Junia closed her eyes and watched the man step through the room her mind made of the trail. He hummed, she said finally, low, tuneless, when he tried to put a word to a story he had not told yet. He leaned into weather, as if weather liked people who leaned back. They searched 3 days. Helicopter on day 2, when the wind played nice, no body, no sign. The slope did what slopes do. It took the small and offered back the smaller, a strap end. A pocket knife that might have belonged to anyone. A grin of metal that once was a grommet. Nothing that knew how to clap its hands and say, mine. The internet made its murmurs the way it does. The forums filled with conjecture. The ones who have never been above tree line explain to the ones who have exactly how Talus works. A post from a cousin arrived in the kind of font grief chooses when it has to choose one. Have you seen him? Another from a person who might have known him and wrote that he was the kind of man who never took the last donut. A stranger said, why was she with him at all, as if who walks beside you guarantees you a ladder back down. Dory Keene did not read the forums. She read the mountain. On day 4, she told Kale in a voice that allowed both compassion and math that if the slope had decided to keep him, it likely would continue to keep him until snow learned what it wanted to do and then taught them in spring. Kale nodded, his jaw set lazy and hard, the way the river sets a stone down and then decides where it lives. Junia went home to Albuquerque with stitches like commas along her hairline and a knee wrapped in instructions. She slept 4 nights without the part of sleep that heals. On the 5th night, she dreamed of blue water that did not know it was cold, and a voice saying, "Wait," in a tone of gentle impatience, as if wait were a surprise party she would like if she would just stop walking long enough to see the lights. Come on. Ansel went back to work. Pulls. Wire. The logic of circuits. He found himself stopping on the shoulders of county roads to watch clouds interrogate a ridge and answer themselves with rain. He listened to the recording once more, then deleted it because a voice should be treated like a person's glove. Pick it up only if it is yours or if the person who wore it has asked you to hand it back. The snow came in late October, the way it comes in the San Juans, when it decides to be industrious. It buried the slope's grammar, it set down the season like a book a child might not be ready for. Thanksgiving arrived with a turkey that somebody had to carve whether they wanted to or not. December wrote its short letters, and January forgot to put a return address on anything. In early June of the next year, when the snowpack loosened its jaw, 2 things happened on the same day. At 11:19 in the morning, a pair of hikers from Montrose came down from the saddle above Blue Lake early because the sun had made everything overconfident and the heat on the rock had learned to be a lie. They paused near the outthrust of Talus, where a cairn had once worn an orange bandana and now wore nothing but its own small pride. A zipper glinted among the stones. The zipper was attached to a jacket the color of fog. The jacket was wrapped around the idea of a man. They did what the poster in the ranger station says to do when a finding stops being a finding and becomes a person. Mark the spot. Note the time. Back away in the exact steps you made arriving. Carry more silence than usually carry. Call. The second thing that happened at 1:27 in the afternoon occurred in a backyard in Albuquerque where the cottonwood shed its soft snow over a patch of lawn that wanted more water than the city wanted to give it. Junia's phone chimed. She looked down, thinking it would be the alert she still had not turned off for the county updates. Instead, there was a text from a number she had written down on a napkin and saved on purpose. It said only this: "We found him. Dory." Junia sat on the back steps and watched 3 ants perform a task more complicated than any she had been assigned that week. She did not cry because they had prepared her politely not to expect this. She did not smile because smiling was a verb her face had not practiced with that sentence. She pressed call and heard a voice that wore dust and care. Dory told her what could be told on a phone and promised the rest would be told face to face, because some tellings don't belong to towers and waves. A week later, Junia drove north, past Espanola, where the signs know 2 languages, past Abiquiu, where the river looks like it can't help but gather light, over the state line, that is a thought and a mile marker and a map all at once, into the San Juans, where the air remembers your first name and uses it. Dory met her at the small office with the big map and 2 chairs that had learned to carry tired people. Kale was there too. He set a folder on the table and did not open it until her hands rested on her knees, the way you rest a cup on a saucer. "We recovered Mr. Bale," he said, and the word recovered did not feel like anything except exactly itself. 2 hikers saw the jacket. He left the trail at the switchback, slipped on the lip, and fell more than 30 feet to a shelf. The shelf kept him for winter. He likely died on impact. No signs of anything except the mountain doing what mountains do when you ask them to hold a human being. The autopsy says the thing autopsies say when physics chooses the verbs. She asked the question that had been living in her since the voice said, "Wait, did he speak after I slipped?" We can't say, Kale said. And then because the truth deserved a little mercy, he added, "The shelf where we found him was below your ledge, not above it." which means his voice on the recording was in the seconds before you both stopped standing and started falling. After that, he would have been below you. If you don't remember hearing him then, that is your brain giving you a gift it knew you could not buy for yourself yet. Dory laid something on the table, wrapped in a brown paper lunch bag. "We think this is yours," she said. "We found it lodged in a crack just above where you came to rest. It had become part of the mountain, but it was stubborn in a way that listened." Junia unwrapped the thing, the bracelet from her wrist. The blue and green cords had become one color winter makes. The frayed end had been burnt to keep the braid from unraveling and then worn down again by time. She turned it in her hand, thumb finding the place where the weave had learned her skin and made it a home. "He gave me this at the trailhead," she said. "He said he made 2 of them when he decided to stop drinking 3 years ago. He kept the green, he wore it under his watch. He gave me the blue because I said I had stopped apologizing for being careful the year before, and he laughed and said, 'That sounds like a thing worth marking.' We only knew each other a handful of hours. And yet," she closed her fingers, then opened them again. "Ansel Rook sent me the audio file. Did you know that? He asked if it would help. I said yes before I knew the answer. It did not help, and it did. Both are true." They stood later at the trailhead. The mountains looked less like authorities and more like the long, patient elders they are. A breeze moved through the spruce in a way that would be mistaken for whispering if you were the kind of person who liked to be mistaken that way. Junia closed her eyes and saw the shelf she had not seen. She said his name once out loud and not loud, the syllables answered by not answering at all. They buried Orrin Bale in a small cemetery behind a church that had learned to be ecumenical because the weather didn't care which god you favored. His sister came with the dog whose photo he had shown. She spoke without paper, which meant her mouth borrowed words from the heart, and the heart forgave the mouth for not being tidier. Junia stood 2 rows back and pressed her fingers into the bracelet and found she did not have to press very hard to feel the world answer. Ansel did not come to the service because attendance is sometimes not the right way to honor a stranger you helped. He drove a route that took him past a ridgeline and paused in the pullout that locals use because it's theirs. He left his truck idling. He rolled the window down. A meadowlark said something with conviction and melody. He answered, "I hear you," and meant it. As summer leaned hard into itself, tourists thinned the trails with their curiosity and filled the cafes with their hunger. The blue of Blue Lake looked less like an opinion and more like proof. Dory kept her team on the same frequency, even on days when no one needed rescuing, because habit saves more lives than heroics. Cale kept notches in his days for the kind of paperwork no show has ever made look interesting. It was work. It mattered that it was work. Years later, in a living room in Santa Fe, Junia would set a phone on a table between 2 mugs and play the last minute for a friend who asked very gently to hear it. The friend would listen with eyes open because some listenings deserve witness. In that small recording lived a hill, a sky, a woman, a man, a word made of 4 letters in air, and a sort of silence you learned to share with people you trust. When it ended, they would sit still long enough that the room would remember they were there and offer them back their voices. "What do you make of it?" the friend would ask, not to argue, just to let the world have one more chance to tell her what it thinks it is. "That he said wait," Junia would answer, and meant it kindly. "That I said almost there, and meant it with all my heart. That the mountain was not a villain and not a friend. That the cliff listened and then did what cliffs do. That the phone fell the way a witness sometimes falls and still did its job. That people who did not know me put a rope on and let me become part of their workday. That the second voice is a place in my head now where something can live without having to die again." She would hold up her wrist. The bracelet would have been replaced by another that looked very much like it and not at all like it, blue and green, new knots, same story. She would say, "I tell the mountains out loud now when I turn around. I say, 'See, this is me deciding to see you again.' And sometimes the wind says nothing back, and sometimes it says a sound that is not a word and still feels like one. Here is what does not always fit in the write-up. The last minute of a recording can keep playing long after the file ends. The man's wait can become a way to step out of traffic, to carry a ladder with a friend, to hold a door without trying to become the door. The woman's almost there can become a way to measure a good day, not by miles, but by a turn you made toward kindness when no one was checking your odometer. If you go to the San Juans, and I hope you do, look up. Say the names of the peaks, like they are elders you respect. Tell the sky you will be back before it begins to think about electricity. Pack a bandana, a bright color that could be seen from far away by a stranger who might need a small flag to make a big decision. If you find a cairn, leave it be unless a ranger told you otherwise. If you find a phone, do what Ansel did. Press play only after you have looked around. Then, if you must, listen. Hear the footsteps, the wind, the breath. The word that might be a prayer and might be a joke and might be both. Decide carefully what you will do with the minute you have been given. It will be late somewhere by the time you finish this. It will be early somewhere else. The country is wide and the mountains are quiet, and the phones we carry don't always know when to stop telling the truth. If tonight you hear the wind make a sound that asks you to wait, take one step back from the edge and put your hand on your own shoulder the way a good friend would. If tomorrow your trail offers you a second loop, say yes or no out loud so the day can hear you and keep its promise not to argue. And if the last minute ever finds you the way it found Ansel, at the exact space where listening became a kind of work, let your voice be the one that says, "We hear you, we're coming, then come." He found a staircase in the lake. It still goes up. He did not see the staircase until the wind laid the lake down flat, a high mountain stillness that came like a held breath. It was late afternoon on Fontana Lake in western North Carolina, where drowned hills wear water like a borrowed coat, and the concrete dam throws a cold shadow that teaches you to look twice. The drought had been long, stingy, the kind that draws shoreline back like a tide that lost faith. Ansel Rook, 39, a surveyor who liked boats better than offices, let his rented skiff idle and watched the pale slope of silt with its driftwood teeth. Then the light tipped, and a line of gray stone showed under the green, not random at all, steps as even as counted breaths, leading up from water toward nothing that should exist. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? That October, 2022, the Smokies stood sharp against a sky the color of rinsed linen. The air smelled of leaf duff and gasoline and the faraway tang of rain that was always a rumor this year and rarely a fact. Ansel had driven out from Bryson City after lunch with a paper cup of coffee and a coil of measuring tape because the county had asked for photos of exposed foundations along the North Shore. The maps they kept were honest but out of date, and the lake was telling different stories every week. He wore a windbreaker the color of old blueberries, a hat with a frayed bill, and the face of a man who does not mind being alone if the work has edges. He cut the motor and drifted. The steps began in green water a little deeper than a tall man's reach, the lake clear enough in that pocket to show the top 3 treads before light blurred into bottle glass. They continued above the surface, slick with algae at the line where water had been yesterday, then dry, then dusty, another dozen risers marching toward a slash of bank where saplings clawed at loose dirt. There was no porch, no house, no landing where a hand might reach for a knob, just a staircase that went up and then kept going as if the air were a hallway no one had told it how to be. Ansel nosed the bow toward the steps and let the skiff kiss the lowest dry riser. The hull made a hollow sound he heard in his knees. He stood, tested his balance, and stepped onto the first stone. It held. He took another. The risers were a hair shorter than modern code, built for legs from a different century. He climbed 10, then 11, then 12, a little more than a story, in a house that had learned to take weather as a sermon. He stopped where the steps met an absence and laid his hand on the sidewall that ran up either side like bones. Mortared fieldstone, careful work, the kind that starts with winter in mind. He looked back. The lake held his boat like a hand holds a toy. The dam stood off to the west, all angles and utility, its face unreadable. A loon called once far out, the syllable slanted and old. The stare made no answer, and that felt like an answer. He took out his phone. No signal, which is how stories get their chances. He knelt and ran his fingers over scrape marks in the treads where feet had once taught stone to be polite. He brushed silt from a riser with the cuff of his jacket and uncovered a line of letters someone had cut with a chisel and a spare hour. Willow Gap. The name felt right in the mouth. The steps had belonged to a place on a hillside that no longer agreed to exist. A truck rumbled on the scenic road above the tree line, then faded. Ansel stood. He is not a dramatic man, not a man who says the word haunted when the word history will do, but he felt a little movement in his scalp when his boot tried the next tread up and met nothing it could trust. He lifted his foot and set it again, and the soul found purchase on air as if stone continued in a material too stubborn for his eyes. He could feel something there, a resistance like the way a field of grass resists when you try to step through a place where deer have passed and the stems remember. He pressed. His weight held. He let it go and stepped back, heart knocking once, but not twice. He stood on the stair where real ended and whatever else began. The lake lapped below, measuring the hull against rock. A red maple leaf came down with dignity, landed on the seventh riser, and considered the long work of becoming loam. Ansel took a breath. He is a man who trusts second looks. He took one. The lake belonged to a body of stories people in Bryson City tell clean over pie. When the Tennessee Valley Authority flooded the valley to build the dam in the early 1940s, the town of Proctor had to move. Houses went down to foundations, barns left prints in the earth like giant hands, cemeteries were dug up with care and moved with ceremony, and some say not everything went where it should. On low years, people found stairs and walls, school steps, a chimney with a name carved into a cornerstone. On foolish years, people tried to steal the past, and the mud stole them instead. The county kept a list of places not to be brave. Ansel is not brave. He is patient. He walked back down to the skiff and dug out the coil of tape, a pencil, a stack of flagging ribbon. He thought of calling the park office and decided instead to take his measurements first and be useful with facts. He worked the way surveyors work, lengths and levels, muttering figures under his breath in a rhythm that kept the mind from dramatizing. He wrote Willow Gap on a page and underlined it softly with the pencil because the stone had asked. He measured tread depth, rise, total run to the bank, distance to the current water line, the angle of the bank above the last step. While he worked, a wind came from the east and pushed the surface into a skin. The steps looked less sure then. He set a small cloth bag at the foot of the first dry riser, full of pebbles and a coil of bright ribbon, because people in the mountains know that small offerings are not foolish if they help you think straight. Halfway through, he heard a bicycle bell, clear, bright, a single ring. He straightened. The sound did not belong to a road. It had the roundness of a thing sounded in an open room. He turned his head the way animals do when they want to aim an ear. The bell came again, faint, then a child's voice without words, the way children announce themselves to their own day. The air held it and gave it back. Then nothing. He called out a simple hello. The sound folded into the trees and did not return. He is not the kind of man who says names into a lake, so he went back to his numbers and let the bell be a sound that remembered and moved on. At sunset, he drove back to town. He did not mention the staircase at the diner because new stories grow better if you give them a night to decide their shape. He took his notes to the tiny desk in his rental and drew the thing. He wrote in the margin a line that was not part of any job he had ever been paid to do. The stair goes up past stone. The next morning, the lake wore a fog that fell in slow exhalations from the coves. He put the skiff in early, coffee in a thermos that had learned to keep secrets. The staircase waited. He climbed to the place where his boot had found air the day before. He lifted his foot and pressed again and met the same soft resistance, like cloth pulled tight across a doorway. The fog gathered and thinned. The lake stretched one slow muscle. He set his palm out where a banister would be if someone had considered such things. His fingers tingled with the small current that passes through the body at the exact moment a man tells himself he will try something and believes himself. He raised his knee and stepped onto what was not there. The foot held. He set the other. He stood an inch above the last stone and felt a dizzy smile crawl across his face as if he had been younger once and forgotten how to be. He took another. The air had weight where the step ought to be. He felt it through the rubber of his boot, a density that said, I am not stone and I am not stone. He climbed 3 steps in air and stopped because he is not brave. Breath is a kind of data. He took it in. The fog thinned. The stare under nothing led to a landing that the mind made, whether or not the world did. He imagined a door where the sky was, just to see if the imagination would draw a knob. It did not. He stepped back, down onto the good stone, and laughed once, quietly, pointedly, the way you tell yourself you are still a person whose days have jobs in them. On the 3rd day, he brought someone. Ansel is careful about who he invites into something he cannot name. He called Lucienne Pike, 61, who ran the little historical society in town with the energy of a river in March. She wore a quilted vest and a wool cap and the kind of boots women earn by living here. She brought pastries because facts get hungry and people are nicer when their hands are busy. She listened while he told it. She did not interrupt. She asked one question with her head tilted like a dog hearing a violin. Does it go up? It goes up, he said. They went out together. The skiff felt lightly ridiculous under the weight of their care. The morning did the few small things it always does before it remembers it is in charge. The staircase was there, gray in the light, patient as a broom left leaning against a wall you forgot to keep. Lucienne reached the 2nd riser and stopped, and with an odd humility, put her palm to the wall so the stone might recognize her. She climbed to the place where air had learned a job. He watched her foot commit and hold. She gave him a look he will carry to his last morning. It had the quiet of a person who has been right about something important or wrong about something important and is making room for either result. She climbed one more and stopped. She did not push. She is not greedy. She came back down. Back in town, she made them tea in the society's office, which smelled of paper and lemon oil. She opened a ledger that had belonged to a church over the ridge that no longer stood. She turned pages until the binding sighed and laid flat, and then she tapped a finger next to a line written in a hand that had cared very much about straightness. Willow Gap Homestead, Brysonside. Stair and porch built by M. Garvey, 1931. Stepstones gifted by Applin sisters. She traced the names like a kind of blessing. People give names so the ground will keep them without bitterness, she said. Ansel told her about the bicycle bell, about the child voice that had no words. She nodded once, an economy that could hold an encyclopedia behind it. They found a photo in a folder of houses drowned to make the dam, a woman in a light summer dress halfway up a stair with a baby at her hip, and a boy of about 6 sitting on the landing with a tin pail, watching the photographer with straight seriousness. The steps were the same, the wall the same, the angle of the hillside the same, the lake not yet there to argue. Lucienne tapped a pencil against the margin of the picture and said the thing that opened the room. My grandmother told me she saw the army men come to measure in 38. She said a man from Willow Gap told them he would build his stair to the sky if it meant the water would have to think twice. She said he whistled while he worked, and his boy rode a bicycle so fast it learned the curve of the road and kept taking it when the road turned into a path and the path turned into a trail and the trail turned into someone's memory of a trail. She smiled with one side of her face. I think you found where the whistling goes. That night, Ansel dreamed slow water and a boy's bell moving away just fast enough to be allowed. He woke before dawn with rain, finally practicing its lines on the roof. He left the boat on the trailer and took the road along the river to the dam because seeing the thing that made the change is sometimes a cure. The dam looked itself, muscle and worry. Men in hard hats wave the way men wave when their hands are busy with ladders and they still have manners. The sky had put its gray coat back on. The rain lasted 2 full days. The 3rd day broke open into a light that could make a shuttered room reconsider. He took the skiff out at noon. The lake had risen a hand's width and drawn a green lip on the lower steps. He climbed again. The air steps remained, not drowned by a little more water, not meek. He stood on the 3rd invisible tread and spoke toward the place where a door might be. Not loudly, not foolishly. Hello, he said. Then, because the air had made him braver than he ought to be, he added, I can bring your names back to where people can see them. The lake answered the way lakes answer, by being present with everything around them without offering comment. He sat on the fourth stone step and ate the pastry Lucienne had tucked into his pocket, as if she had known he would forget to eat. He tried the air with his palm again and felt, for just a fraction of heart rhythm, a shape moved across it that was not his hand at all. The story traveled the way stories travel when they are useful. Not online, not yet. In town, over paper cups, in line at the post office, at the walk-in barber with the fish calendar 3 years behind. People gave him their versions. A woman who remembered a man who remembered seeing a parade of porches floating like rafts past the bend when the first flood came. An old man with a face like a woodcut who said he used to fish off a stone stair when his father was alive, and that if you whistled the tune that man used, you could make the bobber nod. A teacher who had kept a box of rail spikes and marbles found on low years and said she would clean them and bring them by the society office so Lucienne could have them or pretend not to want them like she always did. In late October, with 2 hard frosts behind them, the county asked Ansel to guide a ranger and a structural engineer to the site. They went out in a John boat that carried its own echo. The ranger was a woman named Haynes who wore the park's green like a promise and carried the weight of a radio the way people carry their father's ideas. The engineer was a man with a gentle way of touching old things before speaking ill of them. They stood on the 5th stone step and looked up the ladder of air and did not mock it. The ranger wrote in a book. The engineer crouched and set a level on the 2nd tread and laughed once softly when the bubble centered itself as if the past knew about precision. Haynes asked the question, stories have to survive. Is it dangerous? Ansel shrugged in a way that held 3 chapters. It is dangerous the way memory is dangerous, he said. It makes people want to keep climbing. It is dangerous the way stairs are when you forget you have a body with limits. It is not dangerous the way an alligator is, or a bar fight. They set 3 stakes in the bank and tied flagging ribbon between, a line that told people who had to approach that someone else had been wise before them. Haynes asked for a sign, the simple kind that reads caution and does not attempt poetry. Ansel offered to come and keep an eye some afternoons when he had work nearby. She wrote his cell number in her book and tucked the pencil behind her ear in a way his mother would have liked. In early November, a fog rolled in low and forgot to leave. The lake became a page erased and written over, erased again. School buses turned their lights on at noon. The mountain that wears the dam as a decoration hid its fine line. Ansel kept away because the fog makes men do things they forgive themselves for later, and a man ought to reduce his opportunities for forgiveness if he can. On the first clear morning after, he went out early and found 2 objects on the 4th stone step that could not have gotten there by falling. A bicycle bell, rusted but round, the striker frozen in a kind of kindness, and a tin pail, the exact wrong size for anything useful, dented where a boy might have clapped it to make the sound bigger. He touched neither. He sat down. He greeted them with his breath in line, the way you greet animals that have decided to be near you. At 10, Lucienne arrived with a thermos and 2 paper cups and the sort of force field that keeps good men from doing dumb things for no reason. She looked at the bell and the pail and did not pretend not to see them. She took photos that did not flatter the light and said the names in the ledger once: Lowe, Garvey, Applin, Willow Gap. She did not say a boy. She did not say a child. She put her hand on the sidewall and looked up the line of air with the plain candor of someone who has shored up more shelves than emotions and understands both. You can coax a story, she said, but not yank it. Take the bell to town. Leave the pail here for another day. We will see what the lake thinks of compromise. He took the bell gently, wrapped it in a handkerchief he had never found much use for before, and pocketed it like a chosen stone. Back at the office, Lucienne set it next to a photograph and a typed card. Bicycle bell recovered from Willow Gap Stair, fall of 22, likely pre-flood artifact. On the card, a second line in pencil for people who read too fast. The stair goes up. In the 2nd week of December, with the mountains blue as a bruise and the wind deciding to be cruel to make up for lost time, Ansel went out one last day before the holidays. He brought a crowbar because he had promised himself he would not bring a crowbar until the story invited one. He did not need it. The pail had sat, then vanished, then returned, then sat again with a rock in it, a little smaller than a fist. He took the rock out and saw in the bottom of the pail, scratched by some patient hand or the work of a nail held at an angle, 3 words: "Open in summer." He laughed out loud then. So loudly, a pair of ducks took off in a panic and told other ducks about him for an hour. He looked up at the sky, which had forgotten him to tend to larger business. He put the pail back on the step. He told it, with what dignity he could muster, that he would. Winter happened the way winter happens down there. One day, the lake wore a shell of rime like a dare. The next day, it rained hard as coins. Ansel worked a road job in the next county and came home tired to soup and a radio with the news that would not stop wishing it were better. He sent Lucienne postcards from 2 counties over with sketches of culverts no one needed, and she mailed him back photocopies of ledger pages with red pencil underlines that made more sense than his own arrows. By late June, the water had climbed enough to lick at the 3rd riser and cover the 1st. The air above the invisible steps still felt like fabric pulled tight by a careful hand. School let out, and visitors came with coolers and the need to float and forget. Haynes put the sign back up twice. Ansel sat on the 8th stone step more than once and told people kindly that there was nothing up there for them unless they had time to spare and patience to listen. A few listened, most did not. No one fell, which felt like a policy. On a hot Monday, when thunderheads built tall and polite to the south and forgot to arrive, he took the pail and set it in his lap and used the crowbar not as a pry, but as a weight. He eased the thin tin sides apart where they had been pinched back over the lip like a secret. Inside, he found folded oilcloth, soft as a worn glove. Inside that, a photograph no larger than his palm, and a strip of paper with a line that looked like a prayer until he read it, and it felt like a list. The photograph showed the stair as it had been before the lake, the woman in summer dress and the baby at her hip, and the boy with the pail, sitting with a seriousness that has no word in English. The man who must be M. Garvey stood 2 steps down, hat in hand, as if introducing the stairs to whoever had the camera. Behind them, the ridge wore its trees in a confidence the mountains teach. On the back, in careful letters, someone had written, "So you remember how we looked when the water was a rumor." The strip of paper held one long sentence. When they came with clipboards, he whistled the tune about willow leaves and said he'd build the stair to the sky because steps are a kind of truth and the water would have to climb over the truth if it wanted to drown the house. There were names then, 3, the kind that drop out of families and get picked up by strangers who treat them right. He folded the strip back into the oilcloth and put all of it into the pail and set it on the step because the story belonged to the stair more than it belonged to him. In August, a lightning storm chewed on the dam and left it as it had found it. In September, a girl with a blue braid and a polka dot dress climbed the real stone steps and stood at the place where air did its work and played a penny whistle softly, 3 notes, and then a run. Her grandmother sat on the 2nd step and wiped her cheeks with a tissue she pretended was for sweat. Lucienne watched from the bank with a composure she had purchased fairly over years of deciding when to speak and when to file. Haynes wrote a note in her book that read in an unsentimental hand, "Leave space here." The last time Ansel went before the rains came back for real, he climbed onto the 3rd invisible tread and set his palm out at the height of a child's head. He did not feel breath. He felt pressure. A small, exact pressure like the world confirming a measurement you would have sworn was off by just enough to drive you mad. He closed his eyes and saw the boy on the landing with the pail and the bell. He saw a woman take the last 2 steps at a practical pace, baby on hip. He saw a man look out at a hillside that had just become a lake and refuse to let the stair be anything but stairs. He opened his eyes, and the lake went on being a lake. There is not a larger lesson he can give you from this, except the one he wrote in the margin of his notebook after the 2nd week, a sentence he did not quite understand then and understands in the small of his back now. Not everything drowned. Some things learn to keep their shape in the air and wait for your foot. If you go to Fontana when the water is down and the wind minds its manners, You can find the stair if you ask the right person and you promise not to hurry. It will be there the way durable things are there, honest about their age, unwilling to entertain your stunts. You can put your boot on the third step and feel something that does not owe you an explanation hold you anyway. You can look up at the sky and decide there is a door or decide there isn't, and the stair will permit either decision. You can listen for a bicycle bell and you may hear a loon instead, and that will be enough. If you tell the story afterward, tell it the way lakes prefer, with pauses, with dates spoken out loud so the years remember they are not just numbers, with names because names weigh the right things down. Say Willow Gap, say Garvey, say Applin, say a boy, though the paper does not give him to you. Say a woman moving with a baby on her hip and a list in her head and a refusal to shame the stairs with panic. Say a man who whistled a leaf tune and believed in steps the way people believe in scripture, not as decoration, but as an instruction on how to move the body when the body wants to quit. And if you find yourself on a day when the wind drops and the water stills, and you are offered the choice to test a step that does not belong to stone, ask your breath first. Make it even. Set your palm where a rail would be. Put your weight down like a promise. If it holds, climb one and stop. The air prefers people who do not need to conquer it to feel tall. Leave something small on the fifth step. A ribbon, a marble, a bell that waited in a drawer too long. Walk back down and let the day close the drawer. The stair will keep going up whether you are there to witness the miracle of plain persistence or not. That is how some things survived the flood. They decide to be their own house. They decide to be the part of the house you cannot drown.